In 2006, the American Film Institute, or AFI, released a list of, actually they did quite a few of these. They made a list because it was the 100th anniversary of filmmaking. They released a list of 100 cheers for the 100 most inspirational films in America over the last 100 years. And it's a great list of films, great inspirational films. And one of my all-time favorites tops the list. Matter of fact, last Sunday we were talking about, oh, what's your favorite all-time film? And James says, well, my favorite is National Treasure, and I can't remember what everybody else's is, but and then we got into Christmas, and Pam's is White Christmas, and I can't, like I said, I don't really remember what Anna's are, but I do know that my favorite film has really become known as a Christmas classic. But it's not. It really didn't start off as a Christmas classic. It was released in March. And it didn't really start out as much. It really wasn't a big deal. And the movie going public really ignored it. And that film would be Frank Capra's It's a Wonderful Life. It was released in 1946, a year after the war. It starred Jimmy Stewart, one of my favorite old-time actors. Jimmy Stewart grew up here in Pennsylvania in the lead role as George Bailey. And the movie narrates the story of George's life growing up in the town of Bedford Falls. George Bailey has some big dreams, if you know the story. He is compassionate. In his dreams, he wants to shake the dust off this sleepy little town of Bedford Falls, and he wants to go to college and then be an engineer and build things. At least that's the plan. But then life kind of happens. It seems that over the course of his young life, George Bailey is in just the right place at just the right time. You remember there was an accident. The boys were sliding down on shovels onto the ice, and George's brother Harry fell into the water and saved him. There was the time that Mr. Gower, the druggist, was upset about his son dying, and he accidentally put the wrong medicine into a prescription, and George was able to save Mr. Gower from poisoning one of his clients. And all the while, George has big dreams, and he's getting ready to go to college, and there's a big dance. It's a graduation dance, and you'll remember that George and Mary go dancing, and the pool opens up, and they end up all wet. And he goes, "What do you want, Mary?" "I want you to lasso the moon." And that was really George's thing, was to lasso the moon, to do the big, to do the impossible. Unfortunately, that very night, his dad has a heart attack and dies. And he ends up being the main person in the Bailey Brothers building and loan. And a thing that becomes a fly in the ointment to Mr. Potter, the villain in our story. And during a run on the banks on his wedding day, only two financial institutions survive: Mr. Potter's bank and the building and loan. George provides loans so that others can build houses, a tradition that is started by his father. And the story comes to a climax when, on Christmas Eve, when his brother has just saved a transport of men in the war, and he's coming home for a homecoming, and his Uncle Billy is depositing $8,000 into the bank, and Mr. Potter comes in, he goes, "Well, you should be pretty proud of those Bailey boys now." And he puts the $8,000 into the newspaper and slaps it on to Mr. Potter, and loses the $8,000, causing sure financial ruin for the Bailey brothers building and loan, and probably going to send George Bailey to jail. When George finds out that he's on the hook for the shortage, He tries several things, even going to Mr. Potter. He sits there in front of Mr. Potter, and Mr. Potter says, "You once called me a frustrated, warped old man. Well, look at you. Here you are, a young, frustrated, warped man with a measly $500 equity in a life insurance policy. George, you're better off dead than alive." This severely affects George. He takes his car and he ends up ramming it into a tree. And he goes to a bridge. And he thinks about ending his life. And he prays a prayer. He says, "God, if you're up there, help me." Probably at that moment, George Bailey's words could have been these words from the scripture. "Everything is meaningless," says the teacher. Completely meaningless. What do people get for all of their hard work under the sun? Generations come, generations go, but the earth never changes. The sun rises and the sun sets, then hurries around to rise again. The wind blows south and then turns north. Around and around it goes, blowing in circles. Rivers run into the sea, but the sea is never full. Then the water returns again to the rivers and flows out of the sea. Everything is wearisome beyond description. No matter how much we see, we are never satisfied. No matter how much we hear, we are never content. What do we get for all of our hard work under the sun? Can you believe that these words, that everything is meaningless, were written by the world's richest man? They were written by the man who God granted great wisdom to. And he starts off a book like that. Meaningless, everything is utterly meaningless. Well, there's an inspirational speech for you. What do you think about that? But these words were written by Solomon. He is the third king of Israel. He is the second son of David and Bathsheba. And he has been referred to as the richest king ever. And he is a man of great wisdom. We are told in 1 Kings chapter 3 that the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream, and God said, "What do you want? Ask it, and I will give it to you." Solomon replied, "You showed great and faithful love to your servant, my father. You have continued to show this great faithful love to him by giving him a son to sit on his throne. Now, O Lord my God, you have made me a king instead of my father, David, but I am like a child who doesn't know his way around. And here I am in the midst of your own chosen people, a nation so great and numerous they cannot be counted." Boy, he must have heard of Moses' story and Joshua's story, hasn't he? "Give me an understanding heart so that I can govern your people well and know the difference between right and wrong. For who by himself is able to govern this great people of yours?" The Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for wisdom, so God replied, "Because you have asked for wisdom in governing my people with justice and not asked for a long life or wealth or the death of your enemies." Isn't that what we would ask for? If God would say, "What do you want? I'll give you anything." We'd say, "Yeah, give me a long life. Give me, put my enemies to death. Give me riches." And so many times we treat God like a genie like that. But he says, "Because you have asked for wisdom, I will give you what you ask for. I will give you a wise and understanding heart such as no one has had or ever will have. And I will give you what you did not ask for." What? Riches and fame. No other king in all the world will be compared to you for the rest of your life. And if you follow me and obey my decrees and my commandments as your father David did, I will give you a long life. Isn't it amazing? Because Solomon asked for the right thing, he got more than everything he wanted. Wisdom and riches and a long life. And God says, if you follow me and obey my decrees and my commands. Oh my goodness. It sounds so simple, doesn't it? If you follow me and obey my decrees and my commands. I mean, really, what's so hard about that? But did Solomon struggle with that? Did David struggle with that? Did the judges, people in Judges struggle with that? Did the Israelites struggle with that? Did the Hebrews struggle with that? Did Moses struggle with that? Did Abraham struggle with that? Did Adam and Eve struggle with that? Yes. Do we struggle with that?
Yes.
Yes. If you follow me and obey my decrees and my commands, you will have a long life. Christians for millennia have struggled with it. God calls us to follow him and obey his commands. And we even talked about it a little bit in Sunday school this morning. Jesus said that the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. Why do we make it so complicated? It really is. It's very simple. And Jesus said, these two commandments sum up all of the law and the prophets. These two commands sum up the entire Old Testament. And so the Lord gave Solomon great wisdom, and through the Lord's inspiration, Solomon gave us the book of Ecclesiastes. That starts off with that inspirational statement, everything is meaningless. And as I prayed about what the Lord would have me preach this morning, he brought me to the book of Ecclesiastes. In 1965, the folk rock group The Byrds released a single called Turn, Turn, Turn. It was written in the late 50s, and amazingly, here on pop rock radio of the time was words straight out of the King James Version. Here's how it goes. Quote Solomon, word for word. For everything there is a season, a time for every activity under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to harvest. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to tear down and a time to build up. A time to cry and a time to laugh. A time to grieve and a time to dance. A time to scatter stones and a time to gather stones. A time to embrace and a time to turn away. A time to search and a time to quit searching. A time to keep and a time to throw away. A time to tear, a time to mend. A time to be quiet and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war, a time for peace. Here in these words, Solomon reminds us of the cyclical nature of life. That there is a season for everything. You know, we're in that beautiful season of summer that we love, right? We like summer here. Summer is nice. I mean, what a beautiful day we have today. And summer turns into fall, and we get to see all the wonderful maple leaves, and we get to see all the beautiful colors. And unfortunately, fall turns into winter, and then we got to drive over the mountain to Bradford, and And then winter, just about the time you think, God, is it ever going to turn back to spring? We get a hope, and we start seeing the daffodils poke their head up, and it turns to spring, and spring turns back to summer. Even the church here, we The church calendar is very cyclical. We have Advent, where we prepare for Jesus to come. We have Christmas, where we celebrate God coming in the form of a baby. Epiphany, where Jesus is revealed to the world. Lent, where we prepare our hearts for his death. Easter, where we celebrate his wondrous resurrection. And then Pentecost, when we celebrate the Holy Spirit coming upon the church and growing up in the fullness and likeness of Christ. There are seasons to life. We often talk about what season of life we were in. Pam and I are in that really kind of awkward season in life right now. Matter of fact, Pam's brother took his only child, he and his wife took their only child to college yesterday, and they are now empty nesters for the first time in 20 years. They don't have anybody at home except them. We are not in the same place. We have grandchildren, and we have children living at home with us. We have a college student. It's very unique, you know. You all are in a certain season of life. Most of you are empty nesters. Most of you know what it's like to not have any kids at home, but have grandkids that come and visit. Matter of fact, some of you have older grandchildren who are on their own, and they are having kids. We talk about the seasons of life, and believe it or not, there's even seasons of life in the church. I'll take it one step further, that the life cycle of the church is almost identical in length as the human life. George Bullard tells us that a church plant that is planted and makes it past 7 years, on average, will have a life cycle of about 80 years. Now that should be a sobering thought, considering that last year we celebrated our 80th anniversary. And as we look around, it's easy to see that our congregation is aging, and that there are just a few young people. And most of those, I would consider myself kind of a young person, but even I'm getting up there, you know. We're getting to that season of life where we have grandchildren and kids going off to college. And there's a temptation for us as humans, as I think about the church, there's a temptation for us as humans to look back on the good old days, right? You know, many of you have testified how God has moved in the past. And I have shared portions of the history written by Margaret Palmer and Susan Burroughs. You know what? I think that's awesome. There are good reasons to share about how God has moved in the past. Can I say this? That we must never, never, never forget our legacy. Just as we sang in that very first song, it says, "You've been faithful forevermore, and I know you'll do it again." We need to remember that God was faithful in the past, because we know that will remind us that God will be faithful in the future. We must never forget our legacy. We must never forget who we are. We must never forget how we got here. And as we continue this morning, I want you to remember how much I value the past. That how much I value the history of McCrae Brook. My own parents and Pam's parents handed down to us a wonderful Christian legacy. And for that, I am eternally grateful. There are days I still wish I could call up my father-in-law and say, "Dick, here's something I'm struggling with in the ministry. Could you help me out?" And I know there's days that Pam's wishes she could call her mom and say, "Hey, Mom, you remember what it's like being in the ministry. Could you help me out?" Our parents handed us down a wonderful Christian legacy, and we are trying to do the same for our children. And now I know Rebecca and Michael are trying to do the same for their children. But even as people, we can't just live on the legacy of our parents. We have to make Christianity our own. And like I said, sometimes there is a tendency to dwell on the good old days. And did you know that Solomon, in his wonderful wisdom, said something about the good old days? I put it up in a couple different versions only because I wanted you to see kind of. I almost put it up in the original King James because it almost sounds like Shakespeare. But I put up the New King James. Here's the New King James Version. It says, "Do not say, 'Why were the former days better than these?' For you do not inquire wisely concerning this." NIV says it a little more plainly. "Do not say, 'Why were the old days better than these?' For it is not wise to ask such questions." The NLT, it really cuts to the quick. "Do not long for the good old days. This is not wise." Common English Version. I like this. It isn't wise to ask, "Why is everything worse than it used to be?" Ouch. Ouch. You know, this is true whether we're talking about our community of faith or whether we're talking about the community of Eldred. Hey, I hang around in the community a lot. I hear what people say. "Oh, don't you remember when? Don't you remember when?" We hear it a lot. You know, and it is sad to know that a once thriving community of almost 1,600 people has whittled down to half of its size at 800. You know, a school district that once had over 1,000 students in it is now down to 600 students. The kindergarten graduating class last year was 50. The kindergarten class this year is 34 in Otto Eldred School District. And you hear about, "Oh man, wasn't it great when we had 2 grocery stores, a movie theater, and a barber shop, and a bank, and a hotel, and we had all these things in Eldred." And sometimes we look in our community and say, "Oh, wasn't it so great back then?" And sometimes we do the same thing in our faith community. One of the things that we pastors here often hear when we try to attempt something new is, "Pastor, we've never done it that way before." And I want to say that I say all this because I'm very concerned about where McCray Brook could possibly go in the next 5 years. I see the absence of young people in our midst. And I want to say that McCray Brook is not the only church in the Otto Eldred School District that's dealing with such issues. I know for a fact that St. Raphael's has one young family in their congregation. One young family. Duke Center doesn't have any young families in their congregation. Coreyville doesn't have any young families in their congregation. Now, Eldred United Methodist has a few, and so does the Church of God. But I really feel like we've missed the boat in reaching a new generation for Jesus Christ. How do we face it? How do we step up to the challenge? Do we just circle our wagons and say, "Yep, we did our best and that's all there's going to be"? Or do we continue to try to actively engage in our community? Over the last 3 years, Pam and I have purposely engaged with our community, and we've seen some fruit from it. It was really interesting when we showed up at the training a couple weeks ago, and Mr. Ramsey says, "You're going to get up and close and personal with people." We got up close and personal with people. And it was so cool because we got a chance to work with people who we've already had an initial contact with. And I'm really excited. I'm really excited about this kids club because I know that Renee has already said that if we had a kids club on Wednesday night, that she could get at least 10 kids here. Yeah. You know, we only had 3 to 6 kids here for Vacation Bible School, and I considered that a success. And I'm excited that we are going to be able to reach kids in our community. Now, is Kids Club going to look like what CYC or Clubhouse looked like years ago? No. If you were here for Vacation Bible School, you will know that Vacation Bible School today doesn't look anything like Vacation Bible School did 30 years ago. I mean, it was sweating with the oldies here. But you know what? I saw kids who were hungry for the gospel. They don't even know the story of Adam and Eve. But you know what? All the more reason we should try harder and harder to reach them. I want to be very clear. The message of the gospel has not changed and will not change. The fact that Jesus came as a baby, first of all, that God created us in His image, and that we are unable to follow His rules, that He had to send His Son Jesus Christ to come, dwell with us, to die on the cross, to rise again on the third day, to go up in heaven and to prepare a place for us, and one day He's coming back. That hasn't changed. That hasn't changed a bit. But how do we tell that story? How do we tell that story? Maybe the methods can change. Now, Solomon was a bit pessimistic when he said that there was nothing new under the sun. And that may be true, you know. But I really believe, Pam and I believe, that there are fresh expressions. It's funny that this is the third time this word's coming up today. There are fresh expressions of God's grace. I really believe it. The prophet Jeremiah said, "Your mercies, your grace is new every morning." And I believe that we need to take advantage of God's fresh expressions of grace. And I really want to encourage, and I'm actually coming to the congregation first before I even talk to the board about this at our next board meeting. But I think we need to, I want to encourage us to rethink of how we do ministry so that we can reach a new generation for Jesus Christ. Perhaps it's Kids Club. I was reading an article just this week about one of the things that churches are doing so that they can reach more people for Jesus Christ, even small churches, is offering church services in different venues, that they're offering church services at different times, and some people will say, well, but you're just catering. Well, you know what? There's a lot more people who now work during, you know what? There are a lot of people who are working at this hour, right now. And they work every Sunday. Matter of fact, Joan Van Camp, she has to work on Sunday mornings. So why do we just limit ourselves to worship at this particular hour on a Sunday? We could worship on Tuesday night. We could worship on a Saturday night. I really want us to start thinking, because maybe we can expand our ministry simply by offering worship more often. And there's a real danger in what I just said, because when I say that we need to rethink how we do ministry, sometimes people hear, well, we need to rethink how we're doing ministry, and you say, well, Pastor, you're saying we're doing it wrong. And that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying we're doing it wrong. I am saying that, matter of fact, I'm saying, to paraphrase the title of the sermon, we have had a wonderful ministry here at McCraybrook over the last 80 years. And we have received a wonderful gift from the Lord. However, unfortunately, the way we did ministry 20 years ago, believe it or not, 20 years ago was the year 2000. Is that hard to believe or what? 20 years ago was the year 2000. But we can't expect to do what we did 20 or 30 or 40 years ago and still be relevant to our culture. Remember, the message does not change, but sometimes the methods need to. We can't do the same things that we've done in the past and expect the same results. We can't simply go through the motions. We need a fresh infilling of God's Holy Spirit. And one of the things that I believe that God is calling us to do is to build a bridge from the past into the future. And as I've already said, and I want to read it the way it's written here, in a church like McCraybrook, sometimes it's easy to feel that because we are moving forward into new expressions of ministry, that we are betraying the legacy of those who have gone on before us. And I want to assure you that I believe that people like Margaret Palmer and Susan Burroughs and others, when they see that we're trying to reach new people for Jesus Christ in new ways, they're up in heaven and going, yes, go ahead, go for it, church, go for it. Because the real tragedy would be hold on to the legacy of McCraybrook and fail to move forward, and in 5 years from now lock the doors for the last time. That would be a real tragedy. So my prayer is that we can move forward so that people can experience the life-changing, transformative, I want you to hear the words I'm using, and I used on very purpose, life-changing, transformative power of the gospel. You know, we are a church that believes in the hope and holiness of Jesus Christ. That is life-changing. That is transformative. Just think, if the Lord would light a fire under us, what we could do in this small, sleepy little town of Eldred. I really believe it. And so here's my challenge for you today. What is your vision of what McCraybrook Wesleyan Church could be or should be? So I challenge you this week to pray. I want you to pray this way. That God would lead us into a Spirit-filled, Spirit-led, fresh movement of God so that people can see a church filled with the transforming presence of God. And I'm not talking about the building, I'm talking about you. That God would see you filled with the transforming presence of God. Is that a good prayer or what?